Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to this session this evening. My name's Doreen Donald. I'm Vice President of the Mississippi Lakes Association, and I'm also Chair of the Environment Committee of the MLA as well. And I'm really pleased to be introducing this session tonight, Intro to Aquatic Invasive Plants and EDDMapS in Lanark County. So just to cover a little bit of housekeeping, the session is being recorded. It will be available to all participants after the session is finished. You are in listen mode only, meaning that your microphones and your video is turned off. We will have a question period at the end of the session. If you have questions, and I know I do this, something will come up, and if I don't write the question down, I'll forget it. So you will see on your systems that there is a question feature. Please write your question in there, and we will address them toward the end of tonight's session. And if there are other questions after the session, there will be a survey that you'll be asked to complete. You could ask some questions in there, or you can email myself or our two presenters this evening. So first of all, I'd like to give you just a really quick overview of the Lake Association. Derissa, if you could move the slide forward.
Yes.
Thank you. Our association's been around since 1944, quite a long time, and it began with a focus on aquatic vegetation and putting in marker buoys for safe navigation, and we do that to this day as well. We deploy close to 60 buoys on our lake, and you'll see a map of it on the right-hand side of the screen. We incorporated our organization in 2002. We published our first lake plan in 2015, and just this spring at our annual general meeting in May, we published an updated version of that lake plan as well, which is a guiding document for our organization. Next slide. Our mandate is, I think, quite expected, to promote the maintenance and protection of the lake and make sure we've got a balance between the needs of the users of the lake and maintaining the ecosystem and the environment. We have a very active environmental committee, and we do a lot of activities like invasive species surveys, which help enhance the quality of the lake and the lands that are adjacent to our lake. We also work on encouraging the awareness and adherence to marine and other relevant laws. We have an initiative on right now in terms of water safety, which has been going on for a number of months, and we've done a webinar on that and such as well. Navigational hazards, that's our buoy maintenance program, which I mentioned earlier. And we like to liaise with and represent the needs of our members and other organizations and agencies as well. We have about 550 members in our association, and it'll hover between 500, 600 members. So it's a good size organization for our lake. Next slide. So tonight we're talking about invasive aquatic species, IAS. Our lake association has conducted 3 surveys on the lake in the past 5 years. When we've done those surveys, we found Eurasian Watermilfoil, flowering rush, Phragmites, European frogbit, and curly leaf pondweed, and they've been in the lake for some time. We're fortunate in that we've got a fairly good flow rate in our lake, and the populations and areas where we have these invasive species don't seem to be getting significantly larger, which, we'll keep our fingers crossed on that. We're going to be doing another survey this summer, in July, and we're going to have a specific training, operational training session on June 29th for all the participants of the survey. And then we'll be conducting our survey on July 24th or on the 25th of July, should it rain on the 24th. And if you're interested in helping out on the survey, just email me at environment@mlakes.org, and I will put that in the question so everyone can see that at the end of the session. One of the things that we're watching for and keeping our eyes open for are water soldier and European water chestnut, and they'll be talked about tonight. And we want to also start promoting the use of EDDMapS, and that's going to be a big part of the discussion tonight. And obviously we're doing this webinar. So I'm really, really pleased to have connected with the Invasive Species Centre, and I want to introduce the two presenters tonight. Dorissa Vincentini is a community action leader at the Invasive Species Centre. In her role, she coordinates education and outreach initiatives and promotes community action to mitigate the spread of invasive species in Ontario. This happens through the coordination of the Early Detection and Rapid Response Program, EDRR, which will be talked about tonight, and that relies on citizen science to help prevent, detect, and monitor new invasions. Dorissa's fairly new to the Invasive Species Centre, but that doesn't stop her great enthusiasm and great assistance in pulling this presentation together. Lauren Bell is the program manager from the center, and she oversees the implementation of science outreach and partnership programs at the center. She's been at the center since 2016 and has led the coordination of a number of different invasive species projects, including facilitating a community action programming through the EDR network, zooplankton diagnostics lab, and a lot of other projects as well. Lauren also currently leads the National EDDMapS working group, so that's why she's going to talk about EDDMapS tonight. And she also sits as the Canadian representative on the board of directors for the Midwest Invasive Plant Network. So we have two excellent presenters tonight. I thank them in advance for the presentation. I hope you all enjoy it. And like I said, if you have questions, put them in the question box and we will discuss them at the end of the session. So over to you, Dorissa. Thank you.
Thank you, Doreen, for the introductions, and thank you for inviting us here tonight. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending the Intro to Aquatic Invasive Plants and EDDMapS in Lanark County webinar. Before we begin the presentation, I would like to acknowledge the land that we are speaking to you from today. It is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe peoples in the Robinson, Huron, and Treaty area. Just a brief overview of the agenda. We will talk about what an invasive species is. We'll introduce you to the Early Detection and Rapid Response Network, introduce you to some of the aquatic invasive species specific to Lanark County, and some resources and where to find them. And then we'll talk about EDDMapS and how to report sightings of invasive species, followed by a question period at the end. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, the Invasive Species Centre is a not-for-profit organization that connects stakeholders, knowledge, and technology to prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species that harm Canada's environment, economy, and society. An invasive species is an organism that is introduced outside of its native range and causes harm within its new introduced range. A non-native species is not inherently considered invasive, and it has to negatively impact the economy, ecology, or society in its introduced range to be considered invasive. And typically, invasive species affect all three. Some of the characteristics of an invasive species after it's been introduced are that they're fast growing and reproduce very quickly, becoming very prolific. They lack natural predators in this introduced range that would normally slow their spread and keep their population in check. And the species that they target often lacks natural defenses against the invasive species from not having evolved alongside each other. Increased trade and travel have been the catalyst for spread of invasive species across the world. Sometimes this is intentionally by importing a species, like introducing a plant due to its aesthetics or aesthetic appeal or medicinal properties in other areas of the world. Or sometimes it's unintentional, like the case with a lot of aquatic invasive plants that hitch rides on big shipping freights, for example, in the ballast water. Because of this, the number of introductions of invasive species continues to increase. One way that we tackle invasive species is through the power of community science. Community science is important for increasing education and outreach to further the collective understanding of invasive species and their pathway of spread. It provides collaboration between public and scientific communities. And it's an extremely cost-effective way to collect important data and gain access to new areas. It increases the eyes on the ground contributing to important research and monitoring. And the more eyes on the ground means we're more likely to spot those first detections of a new introduction or of an invasive species that is expanding its range. So the Early Detection and Rapid Response Network, or the EDRR, is coordinated by the Invasive Species Centre and is delivered in partnership with the Ontario Invasive Plant Council and the Eastern Ontario Model Forest Ontario Woodlot Association. It's funded by the Ontario Trillium Fund right now. The EDRR network is a community science and community action network aimed to train citizens on how to detect, report, and respond to invasive species within the province. It's an eyes-on-the-ground approach to stopping new introductions or preventing further spread of invasive species. We achieve this by providing the tools, training, and resources through education and outreach so everyone can play a part. The EDRR network helps fill the invasive species knowledge and tool gaps and inform communities of incoming threats. It helps coordinate stewardship removals with local organizations and volunteers. It links partners with invasive species resources and volunteers and other needs, and it provides opportunities to work with a wide range of organizations on various areas and projects. We also help foster community science and community actions. We provide resource production and dissemination so the public can access all the knowledge and tools that they need. And we also respond to public inquiries. So this graphic depicts the invasion curve, and the EDRR network focuses its efforts at or before species arrival right there. That could be a local arrival within your community or all the way up to a high-level new introduction, high-level threat new introduction to Canada. Prevention and early detection are key in mitigating the cost and time required to manage a species. It also increases the feasibility of that species being successfully managed early, the earlier that it's detected. So the earlier that we can detect a potential invasive species, the quicker we can act or react to eradicate the species before it has a large impact on human health, biodiversity, the economy, or society. Once a species is established, the strategy often shifts from eradication to managing or containment. So that's why we want to catch it before that. From 2020 to 2022, the EDRR network is focusing its efforts in Eastern Ontario, which has kind of allowed us to be here today and bridge some of these resource gaps. What you can expect from us is the EDRR network provides webinars, community science opportunities, early detection alerts and outreach, educational materials, and best management practices and expertise, as well as presentations and resource sharing between partners and much, much more. So now we'll introduce you to some of the species that are specific to Lanark County. And a lot of them are depicted here. We're only going to choose a couple to talk about tonight just due to the time limit, but if you have questions about other invasive species, you can ask us tonight or in an email afterwards as well. And you can always find more information on our website. So Phragmites, which is also known as the common reed, it can grow on land, but it does prefer wet ecosystems, so it does fall under the aquatic invasive plant. Invasive Phragmites is very prolific as it has three means of reproducing. It reproduces through seeds, stolones, and rhizomes. There is a native cousin of Phragmites, which makes identification a bit tricky. There's no single characteristic that can be used to identify invasive frag, as there are anomalies based on what type of environment it is living in. So for example, if it's living in wet versus a dry environment or a high nutrient versus poor nutrient environment, it may look a little bit different and their characteristics overlap. But generally you can follow some guidelines. So invasive frag grows up to 15 feet tall, whereas the native Phragmites species maxes out at 7 feet. So that's quite a difference. The invasive frag has like a rough, dull stem. The leaves are usually a bluish green, dull color as well. And the leaf sheaths remain attached to the stem even well into the fall and over the winter. The base of the stem in the spring is often a tan color and then leading into that kind of bluish green dull color. And they grow in a very, very high density. So the stems of last year or the stalks of last year that are dead will stay standing and erect, and then the new shoots will come out in between them. So it creates a very dense environment. And in the picture on the left, you can see that the invasive frag seed head is a deep, like purplish red color, and it has a lot of seeds in there as well. In contrast, the native species often has a smooth and shiny stem. It has a very like vibrant yellow-green leaf color in contrast to the dull bluish-green leaf of the invasive. And the leaf sheaths are very easily removed and fall off in the fall. The base of the stem is like a reddish color in the spring, turning to a tan color like you can see in the top right. And they grow in a very low density, and often you can find other native plants kind of growing in amongst them, whereas you wouldn't find a lot of native plants growing in amongst invasive Phragmites stand. And the seed head of the native species is a lot more sparse, and the seeds are like a tan color, as you can see in the left-hand picture. In water, frag is actually easy to manage because by manual removal of cutting the stem with a raspberry cane, a spade, or loppers. The OIPC has produced a brand new best management practices guide that goes in depth on each management method and has details on everything that you need to know. So highly recommend checking that out. And as I mentioned before, in order to be considered invasive, the species must negatively impact at least one of these three areas, and it usually impacts all three. So Phragmites is very detrimental to the ecosystem because it not only does it outcompete native plants, but it's also allelopathic, which means that it produces chemicals that actually inhibit the growth of other plants. So you rarely see native plants growing amongst an invasive frag stand. Phragmites is also affecting all of the species at risk reptiles in Ontario because it often establishes in their overwintering grounds where it can completely change the ecosystem. It grows so thick that turtles have difficult time moving around. And it also shades out the area, and reptiles are ectothermic, so they rely on basking in the sun to regulate their body temperature in the spring and the fall. So this becomes a hazard. On top of these ecological impacts, frag also creates economic issues where it causes high maintenance costs on roadways and to properties, as it can actually grow like right through asphalt, causing issues with infrastructure. It's also a fire hazard since the dead stems of invasive frag remain standing in thick stands, and it becomes very, very dry, so it's easy to catch fire and spread. It's also a health hazard as it reduces visibility on corners and along highways. And when you're managing frag, the cut stems become really, really sharp. So it's also posing a risk of injury to humans. Distribution of Phragmites right now it can actually be found pretty much all over Eastern Ontario and is spreading more and more each year. But since frag can be managed more easily than other aquatic invasive species, there's still hope for reducing its spread even further. Eurasian Watermilfoil is a perennial plant that grows under the water surface until it flowers. The tiny reddish flowers grow on spikes 5 to 20 centimeters long that rise above the water in late July and early August, as you can see in the picture on the right, top right. The feather-like green leaves circle the stem in groups of 4 or 5, and each leaf has 12 or more thread-like segments or leaflet pairs. So in the bottom right corner here, this whole thing is one leaf, and then these pairs of protrusions are a leaflet pair. So that's what you count. And there is a native water milfoil called the northern milfoil, and they hybridize between each other as well. So it makes it very difficult to actually identify which plant you're dealing with. And the only way that you can, or counting the number of leaflets is really the only way to determine which milfoil you have. So Eurasian water milfoil has 12 to 21 leaflet pairs, whereas the northern native species only has 5 to 9 leaflet pairs. And then hybrid version organism has right in between from 8 to 12 leaflet pairs. If you aren't sure which species you have, you can always snap a photo and report it anyways. There's no harm in doing that. They reproduce both from seed and fragmentation, which means pieces of the plant that become dislodged or broken off can actually reestablish, making total eradication unlikely once it has been established. A lot of aquatic invasive plants cause similar impacts since it's a lot of the same processes that occur. So when the species becomes established, it creates very dense mats, which often inhibit boating and makes it difficult or impossible to swim. These dense mats crowd out native aquatic plants, which then start dying and decomposing, which can create an anoxic environment where the oxygen is being used up by decomposers. This in turn can affect fish population and diversity, which may impact commercial or recreational fishing. The dense mats in the water can also decrease property value. Eurasian water milfoil mats can also create a breeding ground for mosquitoes. As I mentioned, Eurasian water milfoil is a very prolific plant and that spreads through fragmentation. And this makes it very difficult to manage since if you aren't careful enough, you can actually accelerate the spread rather than managing the population. So I'm not going to get into managing Eurasian water milfoil because the OIPC's best management practices is a great resource that goes into detail on everything that you need to know. Eurasian water milfoil can be found pretty much across southern and eastern Ontario, even extending up into parts of northern Ontario. The important thing with this species is that it's very difficult to eradicate. So it's more important to place our efforts in preventing the spread into new areas. So water chestnut is native to Europe, Asia, and Africa. It has floating leaves that are green and triangular with sharply toothed edges. And the leaves form these densely crowded rosettes up to 30 centimeters in diameter, as you can see in the bottom right corner. They have leaf stems that grow up to 15 centimeters long with a spongy swollen section that helps the plant float. And the leaves that are underwater are actually a feather-like leaf with finely dissected leaf segments, which you can see in the left of the top picture there. They have small flowers of only about 8 millimeters long that are white and have 4 petals. There's no lookalikes in Ontario, which makes them an easy candidate for detection. So if you see something that looks like this, definitely report it. Water chestnut has hard, woody seeds that grow to 3 or 4 centimeters wide with sharp, barbed spines. The viable seeds are a greenish brown and sink to the bottom of the water body, while the older seeds that are no longer viable turn black and they float until they wash up on shore. These nuts bear no resemblance to the water chestnut used in cooking that we're all familiar with. And water chestnut prefers lakes, rivers, streams, and ponds with soft substrate, full sun, and nutrient-rich waters. They can be found in shallow to deep water, but are most abundant in waters around 2 meters deep, but have been found in waters up to 5 meters deep. As I said, aquatic invasive plants pose similar impacts to the economy, society, and ecology of their newly introduced range. So water chestnut, like Eurasian Watermilfoil, also grow in dense mats, which crowd out native vegetation, decreasing oxygen levels and reducing fish diversity and population. The dense mats reduce property value and get tangled in boat motors and make it difficult to swim. Water chestnut does pose a unique threat to human health as its seeds wash up on shore and sink to the bottom of water bodies, making it likely to encounter the sharp seeds and it becomes a hazard to step on. The first water chestnut population in Ontario was found in the Ottawa River and was initially eradicated. As of right now, it can be found around Wolfe Island in the St. Lawrence River, the Rideau Canal, and Greater Cataraqui River in Kingston. Ducks Unlimited works to eradicate, control, and prevent the spread within the Lake Ontario watershed. So early detection of water chestnut is key. If you report a new sighting of this species, it's likely to be followed up with by Ducks Unlimited, Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, or the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. Water soldier is native to Europe and Northwest Asia. It kind of looks like an aloe plant, spider plant, or the top of a pineapple. It does have native lookalikes in Ontario. And the leaves are 40 centimeters long, roughly 40 centimeters long. They're shaped like thin swords and with very sharp serrated edges. They're bright green and grow in circles, large circles. In Ontario, they rarely produce flowers, but if you do see them, they're small and they have 3 white petals. Mature water soldier produces offsets similar to spider plants, so they look like basically smaller versions of the adult plant. And again, water soldier can grow in thick mats just like the other species, which decreases your water oxygen, reducing fish population, impacting recreational and commercial fishing and property value. It also makes angling, hunting, or boating and swimming difficult. And water soldier can also alter the chemistry of the water body, making it less favorable for native species. And water soldier also causes a unique health hazard in that the sharp serrated edges can actually cut swimmers passing by. Water soldier is a prohibited species under the Invasive Species Act, which means it's prohibited to possess, sell, or move water soldier within Ontario. The only known established population of water soldier is in the Trent River. And water soldier is another species where that early detection is really important, and reporting of a new sighting is really key because it is under management by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry and the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. Oops. So what can you do, or what you can do? You can learn to identify aquatic invasive plants and how to prevent accidentally spreading these plants with your watercraft. You can avoid infested areas and reduce your speed when traveling by any invasive aquatic plant infestations. So boat wakes and motors can actually dislodge plants and offsets or break off fragments, allowing them to spread to new areas and accelerating that process. So you can inspect your boat, trailer, and equipment after each use as well. So remove all plants, animals, and mud before moving to new water bodies. And avoid planting or purchasing invasive aquatic plants in your water garden or aquarium. So water gardeners should only use native or non-invasive plants and are encouraged to ask garden centers and aquarium suppliers for plants that are non-invasive. So when you're inspecting your boat and your trailer and your equipment, make sure to clean off all visible debris from your boat and outdoor equipment, drain out all of the live wells and standing water, and dry your boat and outdoor equipment thoroughly before entering a new water body. And this significantly reduces your chance of introducing invasive species into new water bodies. Other ways to reduce pathways of spread that aren't necessarily directly related to aquatic plants but other invasive species are to don't dump your bait. The provincial government has protocols on how to properly dispose of bait within Ontario. When we talk about cleaning your equipment, we don't just mean boats and trailers. This extends to land as well. So seeds and plant fragments can actually hike on your boots, moving from place to place. Don't move your firewood. Buy and burn local firewood, as insects and pathogens can hide under the bark and inside the wood. And always choose native species when possible in gardens, water gardens, or aquariums, anywhere. Always choose native species. Now I'll share a bunch of resources that we've talked about. So those best management practices that I've already pointed out to you can all be found in our best management practices database, along with a plethora of other best management practices for other species as well. On our website, you can also find technical bulletins and invasive species impact fact sheets, like how it's related to climate change and how it impacts climate change. If you're looking for more information specific to one species, then you can check out our species profiles, which will also link you to the resources for that species. And the Invasive Species Centre also does a number of webinars in collaboration with other organizations, and they're all on our YouTube channel, so you can check out any previous webinars that we've had and other information and videos on there. You can join our newsletter to get upcoming information, new threat alerts, and best management practices that come out, the spread on our website. And you can get informed with any invasive species that are in the media. Now I'll pass it over to Lauren to talk about how and why we want to report invasive species.
Thanks, Teresa. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about EDDMapS. So if you're not familiar with EDDMapS, it is the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. It is run out of the University of Georgia in the United States, and it is found across Canada and the US. The expansion into Canada is relatively new and exciting, and so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the process of reporting, some of the benefits, and some of the more specifics on, what is the why behind why we should report. So if you wanted a little bit more information on EDDMapS, the links are there, but essentially you can type EDDMapS into any major search engine or eddmaps.org. It's also available as a phone application on Apple and Android devices. So EDDMapS is kind of at your fingertips, whether you're using a computer or whether you're using a phone. So EDDMapS is extremely user-friendly and easy to use. You don't require any previous knowledge of GIS, which is a huge benefit for this platform. It's extremely user-friendly. It's completely free. Essentially what you do is you create an account on eddmaps.org, and you're set to go. So it's a platform that you can use kind of at your discretion and as you're interested in, and there's that need to not have any background knowledge on GIS is a huge selling point for EDDMapS. So let's get into how to use EDDMapS. So once you've created an application and signed in with your user account, you can make an observation at any time, either through the application, if that's your preferred method, or through the website platform. And so essentially how it works is you're out in nature, you see an observation that you're interested in reporting, you enter the information into EDDMapS, and in a moment we'll talk about what that primary key information is. You can also, if it was of interest, do bulk uploads onto EDDMapS, and there's a really great tutorial on the EDDMapS website that outlines exactly how to do bulk uploads. And we'll talk about where to find that information in a moment. So once you have the invasive species that you suspect is invasive, you don't have to be an expert by any means. There's a lot of tools at your fingertips using this application. Once you report the species that you would like to submit to EDDMapS, that data is then immediately uploaded onto the platform for verification. And this is really what sets EDDMapS apart, is that human verification side. And so in Ontario, these reports are verified by the Invading Species Awareness Program. And so once that data is sent to the verifier, it's either confirmed or not confirmed as the species that you've identified. Once it's reviewed and it's confirmed, if it's not confirmed, it's typically corrected to what the species is. Once it's confirmed, that data is then added to the distribution map, which Darissa had showed you examples of some of these distribution maps for different species that we talked about today. That data is then immediately uploaded as a point on the map that's accessible to anyone interested in seeing that new distribution. It's also available as a record on your EDDMapS profile, so you can go back and make changes at any point. If there was eradication that took place, you can update. There's a lot of different customizations to your profile that are available. And then those points are interactive, so people can go and they can see the pictures that you submitted, and it's essentially adding contributions to a better holistic understanding of where invasive species are occurring across Canada, across the US, across North America. So it's a pretty great platform if you're interested in contributing to those data points. One thing I'll note here too is EDDMapS is only as good as the amount of people that are utilizing it. And so what I mean by that is the maps that we showed earlier, you may see in your community that the Phragmites that's located on your street is not represented in that map. And so those data points are extremely important in order to create a better understanding. It's the best idea we have as to where invasive species are, but it just gets better and better and more accurate the more people that are contributing to it. So there's a couple different reasons why we recommend submitting invasive species reports to EDDMapS. These reports are really, really important, not just for gaining a better understanding of the current distribution, like I just mentioned, but there's a lot of other kind of background items that go into it as well, and just increasing the knowledge of invasive species across Ontario. So some of the reports can be used to select sites for management and outreach, especially, if we use EDRR as an example, we've picked sites based on EDDMapS reports because they were really great sites for volunteer involvement. And so that's just, an invasive species center example of a time when we've utilized these, but it's happening on a much larger scale. It increases local knowledge of distribution. You're able to go in and see what's being reported in your area so that you have a better understanding of what could potentially, be at your doorstep soon. If it's a species of high concern, you can create a notification so that you're aware. For example, giant hogweed being reported in your community. If that's something that you would be interested in knowing about, then you can add those notifications to just stay, one step ahead of the invasive species leading edges. So it does identify those new infestations and leading edges. It helps us understand the movement of invasive species over time through the data that you're contributing. It has the potential to influence policy, and it can enact a response plan. As Darissa mentioned, those new invasive species, whether that's new to Canada, new to Ontario, it can enact a quick response plan from those in charge in order to sort of mitigate that spread from potentially impacting those three pillars you talked about at the beginning. So the environment, the economy, and the society. So there are a couple required fields under EDDMapS. The fields that you must enter are the observation date, the habitat that you found it in, and it's a drop-down menu, so it's pretty easy to kind of field through some of those examples. The location that you saw the species, and again, no GIS is required. There's a couple different ways you can enter this information, either a pinpoint on a map if you didn't want to get down to the specific address. You can have it as a border perimeter, so you can say, it's a 1 kilometer stretch of Phragmites and outline it using the border in order to identify where the species is stretching across, which is really helpful when you're reporting on shorelines. And you can also do latitude, longitude as well. I'll just touch on for a moment too, if you were to go to eddmaps.org/tools, you can find a lot of different resources for uploading, just examples on how to upload, uses of the maps, distribution maps, how to do bulk uploads if that was something you were interested in, if you had a large data set you were interested in inputting. There's a lot of great resources there, so I really recommend checking out eddmaps.org/tools. So I mentioned one of the areas that you have to upload is photos. And so the photos are to help assist with the verification. In Ontario, I mentioned it's the Ontario Invading Species Awareness Program. And so it's really important to have good, clear photos when you're submitting. And so you can upload up to 5. And if it's, for example, if you were doing an invasive plant, you'd really want to focus on sort of the size of the infestation, close-up photos of the leaf, are there flowers present, are there seeds present, and try and get some of those key characteristics to help with the identification. So the timeline for verification does vary by species. Priority is given to really high priority species or brand new introductions. As I mentioned, those would be high risk species not currently known to Canada or Ontario. High-risk species that or it could also apply to high-risk species that are currently established in Ontario but are outside of their known distribution or solo populations outside of their known distribution. And so those are sort of the very, very high priority species that would enact a response plan. But there, like I said in the slide about all the reasons for reporting, there's a lot of really important uses for these maps and distribution as well. There are other ways to report invasive species as well. If EDDMapS and utilizing the platform wasn't of interest, there are different ways to report invasive species, and on invasivespeciescentre.ca, there's a really great webpage where you can learn more about how to report an invasive species in a lot of different ways and across a lot of different areas, so by province and territory. So some of the other ways to report invasive species in Ontario is directly through the Ontario Invading Species Awareness Hotline. And so this is also a great resource to use if you're interested in learning more specifics about EDDMapS in Ontario, because that is the organization that does the verification and runs the program. And you can also report invasive species directly through the Canadian Food Inspections Agency. And this is a great place to call if you think you've seen especially new priority pests that aren't currently known to Canada. You must report them to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So it's a handy phone number to have if you think you might have seen a priority pest. Just another plug for our some of the things on our website. If you are interested in joining our newsletter, we have our quarterly newsletter that goes out every season, as well as our biweekly media scan, research and event scans, and you can sign up to have those directly into your inbox. The biweekly media scan is a summary of all the news, events, and outreach that's happened across the world in the last 2 weeks, and so it's a great summary and especially a great place to look for upcoming events as well. And then our event and webinar invitations right to your inbox if you're interested in learning more about Invasive Species Centre and partner events. And I'll leave it there and flip it back to Darissa for questions.
All right, thanks, Lauren. All right, let me just open up the questions here. So we have a question on how does water soldier spread? Sorry, I'm still looking at the program. So water soldier can spread much like any of the other aquatic invasives that we talked about. It is through both seed and, but mostly through those kind of offsets that it creates in fragmentation. So much like how you can populate a spider plant is how water soldier can populate and then spread to other water bodies. Lauren, I don't know if you had anything to kind of add to that.
No, it's a good point. Accidental introduction and natural movement through as a result of accidental introduction or release can also be a factor in spread. And so, as Darissa mentioned, the Ontario Invasive Species Act, which is a standalone piece of legislation in Canada that helps prevent and mitigate the spread of invasive species. And so water soldier is listed under that as prohibited, as is water chestnut as well. So that's one of the ways we combat the sale, trade, possession, release of water soldier to help prevent that accidental introduction or potential release.
Excellent. That's the only question that I've received so far. If anybody has any other questions, please just drop them into the questions box. Oh, there we go. Does Ontario have any fines for spreading invasives? Lauren, I'll let you answer that one.
Sure, yeah. So the Ontario Invasive Species Act, as I mentioned, is a form of legislation, and so it does have enforcement associated with it. And so, you know, depending on the species, if for example, you were to bring in a species under prohibited, there would definitely be, under restricted, there would definitely be fines associated through the enforcement. And so that's one of the ways that they combat invasive species spread through the e-commerce. And so it's pretty exciting that Ontario has that standalone legislation, and so that's sort of one of the ways that fines. And there's also, you know, the Noxious Weeds Act. There's also the Pesticides Ban, and the Canada-wide Pesticides Act. And so those all come, you know, with rules and regulations as well. And the whole goal is just to prevent and mitigate the spread and protect Canada's natural environment.
Perfect. All right. Anybody else have any other questions? Don't worry if you forgot your questions, or if you have any other questions afterwards, you can always email us or put it in the poll afterwards as well. So we, you know, you don't have just this time period to ask questions. Oh, we have another one. Is the removal of invasives in public wetlands prohibited? Lauren, I'll ship that over.
Sure, yeah. So it depends. If we were to take the word public out of it for a moment, you know, most Canadian waterbeds are Crown land, and so, you know, management on there could potentially require permits. If you had Eurasian Watermilfoil right in your shoreline, you know, as long as you follow the guidelines and outlined on the Ontario Invasive Species, or the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry guidelines, and that's essentially focuses around timelines, and the reason for that is, you know, fish spawning and protecting fish spawning during critical times during the active season. And so, you know, you would not require a permit to manage Eurasian watermilfoil on your property as long as you were actively following the guidelines and regulations as far as timing and other things. And that's manual removal we're talking exclusively. And so from that, you know, if you weren't able to work within those timelines, then yes, you would require a permit in order to do the management. On public land, so outside of private property, it's most likely, yes, you would require a permit, and that's something that you would, you know, you would want to work with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, who oversees that Crown land property, which is the most water body beds within Canada, and those are excluding provincial parks, of course, and federal parks as well, of course. Management wouldn't be allowed by the public. So public removal would require approval by the ministry.
Excellent, thanks, Lauren. We have another one. How do you know when there is a new possible invasive species, like a newcomer? And if you do not know about them, how can you report them?
That's an excellent question. No, that's a really great question, and it's one of the items that, you know, I think I'll flag a terrestrial example here that actually Doris is leading is, you know, understanding the signs and symptoms of an invasive species. You know, it's easier said than done, and it's easier on terrestrial land. You can go back to the same area and there's the same, you know, issues. You know, you see a tree that's having really strong bark cracking, really strong signs of crown dieback. You can start to understand those signs and symptoms and have that knowledge to think, I think there's potentially an issue here. I should document this change. And so, you know, when you're thinking about aquatic invasive species, I think step one is attending things like this and being aware of some of the species that might be on the doorstep, those early detection species. So water soldier is a great example, you know, detected in Eastern Ontario for the first time in history in the Gananoque River. And you know, those early detections and that rapid response is key. And so starting to think and reaching out to organizations like the Invasive Species Centre on some of those early detection species and learning those signs and symptoms is going to be really, really important to helping kind of as a group contribute to that early detection and potential response to some of those newcomer species. So I think, you know, what you're doing today is kind of step one, is just sort of starting to learn a little bit more about some of the species and some of the concerns, and knowing what's here, but also what's, what are the potential invasive species issues on our doorstep. And I think the webinar series that Darissa pitched earlier is going to be a great place to start. Our YouTube has a lot of early detection species covered in detail.
Awesome. Is there a database of lakes that have invasive species present? Can these be posted at boat access points and have websites available to help educate boaters moving from lake to lake? It's a great question.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. For this, I would say, EDDMapS is probably a really great place to start. Check out what's present in your lake as far as EDDMapS. If there's nothing, then I think it's kind of a great sign of that. If you have that knowledge, and please help us contribute to that wider understanding of what's currently found. We do have some programming and signage, and so do partners at different boat access points, because you're 100% right. That's a critical area where, it's not always just what you see, it's also what you don't see. As Doreen mentioned, I manage the zebra mussel and zooplankton diagnostics laboratory at the Invasive Species Centre, and we work with veligers, which are you can't see. So zebra mussel veligers can be present on your boat even if you can't see them. Well, they would be present when you can't see them, and so if they are present, it's something that you need to be aware of, the risks of moving that boat from area to area. And so we have signage for that to make sure that, it's well known, but having a good understanding of what's in that lake so that you can kind of be aware of the things you might not be able to see is also really, really important. So I think to this question, I would say, I would recommend EDDMapS. iNaturalist is also a great place. That data from iNaturalist does feed into EDDMapS. And so, I would just kind of push the use for EDDMapS. If you have, who better to help contribute to that knowledge than folks on the lake. So, I'd recommend, if it's of interest to you, to try and contribute some of that information and those species sightings to EDDMapS to help create that more holistic picture for other boaters.
Yeah, and I would just add that getting involved with your lake association does help as well. Even if there isn't an EDDMap point on your lake, that doesn't mean that there isn't necessarily an invasive species present in your lake. So getting involved with your lake association, if they already do invasive species work or monitoring, or just kind of go out and monitor yourself. I mean, what better way to just explore your lake like you already do and just keep an eye out. All right. That's all the questions I've received so far. I'll give everybody kind of another minute or two to think if they came up with any questions. And again, you can always email them to us afterwards if something pops in your head later on tonight or tomorrow. All right, well, I think that's all the questions for tonight, or as of yet. But I really want to thank Doreen for bringing us in and inviting us here, and for everyone for attending and making the initiative to learn about invasive species so that you can be a part of the community science in your area and keep an eye out. So thank you very much to everybody for attending, and again, Doreen and the Mississippi Lakes Association for inviting us.
Well, on behalf of the MLA and all of the attendees, Darissa, Lauren, thank you very much for your time tonight. It was an informative webinar, and I think it puts us in good stead for our invasive species survey in July, and we're certainly going to encourage using EDDMapS, because I think we need a whole lot more data points on our lake. So thank you very much, ladies. And everyone else, thank you for joining. As Darissa mentioned, if you have any questions, reach out directly to Darissa or Lauren, and you can get in touch with me at environment@mlakes.ca. So with that, I think we'll call it a night. Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks so
Awesome.
much.
Thank you so much. Have a great night.